everybody, and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Don as usual. And today we have returning guest Freddy back to talk some more theological questions with us. But first, I actually wanted to pose a little question to Fred. So he's from New Zealand, and Don's from Canada. So I was just wondering if he felt that there was a similarity between the relationship between Canada and the United States and New Zealand and Australia. I think a lot of people kind of have maybe had this thought before. New Zealand and Canada are both smaller than their counterparts. But I was kind of noticing some other similarities. I think they both have problems with vowel sounds. And I also think that there's a kind of like sitcom wife to the, like the bumbling husband, so like smarter, sort of like a little bit of a superiority complex, kind of carries the moral weight, but ultimately it's like they're just like a supportive kind of role. I don't know. What do you think of that?
God, there's a lot to address there. But I would actually suggest that the superior, because New Zealand does have what you might think is a superiority complex, but like many inferiority complexes, it's really an inferiority complex, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And we compensate for that by trying to make ourselves look better than we actually are. And I assume Canada doesn't do this, but during the Olympics, the New Zealand Herald will always publish a per capita medal table, a medal table adjusted, to the size of the country, because it always makes it look like New Zealand does better.
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, not in Canada. Canada actually is pretty good for medals, especially in the Winter Olympics. So we can't complain.
Yeah, I sat next to some Canadian ice hockey players once on a flight, and we had a good chat. And I told myself, I'm not going to say something like, "Oh, well, we're both from Commonwealth countries, huh?" I told myself I wasn't going to do that, and I inevitably did, and felt awful about it. But
God save the Queen, eh, lads?
Yeah. It's one way you can tell that there's a similarity there is if you look at photos from World War One and World War Two. We're wearing the same uniforms.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the way a lot of people understand the similarity. Because there's one of the things I think is similar is with Commonwealth countries in general, is that we're really into commemorating the First World War.
Yeah.
That's true. That's huge. Americans, like, it doesn't, I don't think it really registered. Like, World War II is the one that counts for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In Canada, it's all like our nation was, forged in fire at Vimy Ridge and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, like Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele were the two.
Sure.
But the Passchendaele one, I always remember because the New Zealand division was relieved by the Canadian division, who went on to win the battle, to the extent you could even win a battle in 1917.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, I would say that like one of the differences between like the Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States relationship is that like Australia genuinely is a terrible country, whereas I think you couldn't necessarily say that about the United States. The United States is too complex. Australia is just it's a country full of ignorant, brutal people who have had it too good for too long.
Okay.
They think they can sustain their lifestyle by just like digging minerals out of the ground forever, but it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to sell out to the Chinese.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that in Canada too, though. I mean, we've got like
right.
natural resources, the oil sands and all that stuff and whatnot. But yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed sometimes like in New Zealand, self-identified socialists will talk about, the New Zealand working class. And I think the idea is that there's meant to be a Marxist, this is meant to be somehow kind of like advanced Marxist analysis, but New Zealand never really had a proletariat. We were we were a country of farmers who then became a country of like bankers and tech startup guys
Mm-hmm.
with really nothing in between. Whereas
Sure.
Australia had a manufacturing industry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think ultimately New Zealand is just too small. New Zealand's really too small to sustain the comparison, and Canada is too large.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, I got one more question before we kind of get onto the real meat of the episode. I've been kind of saying this to myself like ever since we kind of arranged to have you on as a guest. But how would you pronounce the how do I say this without kind of giving it away? So your country has like initials, right? Like so USA for America, CA for Canada. What are they for New Zealand?
In NZ.
Okay. Yeah, I keep going. I've been walking around going Freddy from NZ.
I really had like the overwhelming sense that I was walking into a trap just then.
Sure.
Well, I kind of set that up, yeah.
I thought it had something to do with being a Nazi, like NZ Nazi. I don't know.
Right.
Oh, that's a good one.
People don't know this, but ANZAC stands for Australia Nazi Corps.
Yeah. But I'm glad you're a Z nation. So
yeah,
like
yeah.
Canada.
It's rare, you know. It gives us a lot of our pride comes from the fact that we have a Z in our name.
Sure.
Yeah, I do kind of like Z, like in comparison to Z. Although Z seems like the natural way to say it, and Z sounds like you're trying to be too cute with it or something. But
okay,
you need a consonant on the end. You need a consonant on the end, or otherwise you feel there's just this like this eternal vowel that just hangs there. But
you don't go a bed said. You know what I mean? Like all the other letters are happy to kind of do it that way.
Okay, well, I guess I couldn't have been expected to find a coherent justification for it just off the top of my head, but I think I did pretty good.
Okay.
Maybe being the end of the alphabet, you kind of need like a conclusive end, like Z.
Like there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
We use it interchangeably, really. I mean, Americanisms really did infiltrate New Zealand and Australian culture. There's a lot of, for instance, before we started recording, I referred to cilantro, which is not the Commonwealth way of saying it. In fact, I've actually forgotten what New Zealanders normally call it. I've just been calling it cilantro for so long.
Oh, I didn't even
coriander.
Know that. Yeah.
Is it coriander?
Yeah, coriander. There we go. For some reason, I have a mental block with the word coriander. It's like once I've called it cilantro, I will not be able to remember that I meant to call it coriander.
Okay.
But I think that's American TV.
Like, coriander is I don't know. Coriander is the dried stuff, and cilantro is the fresh stuff. I kind of like that system because they taste different.
Yeah, that's a sort of there's empirical meat to that distinction. I like it.
Yeah. Of course, it's not consistent, doesn't carry through to other things, but I'll take it.
Well, do you have any other questions about New Zealand? Because I think my answers have been pretty good so far.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. You got any for him, Don?
No, I think we'll get into the serious part.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So we were going to talk about the problem of evil. This is a topic that I think, I don't know, I feel like we're due for discussing this. It's kind of popped up here and there on previous episodes, but it certainly deserves an episode of its own. And this is something that Freddy's been thinking about, maybe writing about as well.
Yeah, a little bit of writing about it. I'm going to have to do a lot more writing about it, but because I see that it's going to probably become a pretty centrally important part of a thesis that I'm writing. But just in case, people listening to this hear me speak on the subject and think this guy's actually incredibly ignorant, please understand that I'm only just starting to try and wrap my head around it. Because especially when you're thinking about the concept of evil in connection with religious traditions, I think it's very easy to put your foot wrong. with it. Although in a secular context, in like a non-religious context, I think it's like, it's virtually impossible to say anything sensible about evil. So, but yeah, the problem of evil is it's a central issue in philosophy, because it's generally agreed that one of the strongest arguments against the existence of God is a logical argument from evil, which is to say the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with a God who's powerful enough, and perfectly good, all powerful, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. It's just logically inconsistent for evil to exist if that being also exists. The logical argument runs into technical problems, I think, but there's a sort of a softer argument which says it's just very unlikely that God, an omnipresent, omnipotent, etc. God will exist if evil exists. Given that evil exists, it's very unlikely that God exists. And this is, I don't know, that question that philosophers have been debating for a very long time is, part of the reason why I think it gives people a headache is that it assumes the existence of a particular kind of God, like a personal God who is an agent, who can intervene in history. And I don't know. I feel like this is a concept you need to get clear on before you even start talking about evil.
Sure.
Because who is it a problem for? And I think the question can get bogged down in kind of a like a point scoring match between atheist philosophers and religious philosophers, and you can sort of like lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think for me the bigger picture is like this. The real question here is, how is evil salient for religion? And it's not salient as a logical problem or an empirical problem. I think it's true that one of the reasons, one of the central tasks of a religion is to help people cope with evil. In fact, I think Aquinas even sort of jokingly suggested that the existence of evil is proof of the existence of God, which gives you a sense of the importance of this concept in religion. And it would be odd if this thing that religion is meant to help us deal with is also the thing that is meant to disprove some of its most central tenets. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like, to me, it feels like a question that isn't really going to get an answer. And in fact, the traditional problem of evil doesn't even really seem like the most important question. A more important question from the point of view of religion, I think, is what is evil?
Right. Yeah. And what function does it play in history and God's plan and things like that? Yeah.
And there are so many. The accounts that you can give from a religious perspective are various, and I think this is much more interesting than the narrow sort of philosophical logical problem of evil.
Sure.
Yeah. So what I think a good way of understanding what evil is from a religious point of view is, whatever evil is, it is what religion is promising to save us from.
Yeah.
That's not. In one sense, that's not like that helpful, because you obviously are going to want to know what it is religion saves us from. But I feel like that's not a bad framework for thinking about it.
No, yeah, I agree, because that can be evil within yourself. That can be like kind of tragic accidents that happen in the world. It can be evil that someone else does to you. All this kind of stuff. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's generally, I think the way it's generally used in sort of everyday language is it's something which describes actions, right? Intentionality seems to be quite central to it. at least in a common understanding. But I think that you have to also be able to talk about natural evil.
Mm-hmm.
I think, at least from a religious point of view, suffering. I mean, suffering is a fact of human existence, which I think you're going to have to grapple with when you're talking about evil. I think the fact of human suffering, the fact that life is, a vale of tears, is why it was important for humans to have the concept, and why it's important for religion to at least attempt to define very clearly what evil is.
Mm-hmm.
What would the Muslim perspective be, Tom? I mean, as a Muslim, how would you think about the concept?
Sure. So I'm just thinking how to start with this. So there's sort of like there's a few different schools of thought on this. The Ash'ari position is kind of the dominant one. So it's actually, I think, somewhat similar to the Catholic idea, or at least the like Thomas Aquinas and what he says about it. So good and evil are not inherent qualities. Like they aren't essential. They are just defined by God as being good or evil in an almost arbitrary sort of sense. And not exactly arbitrary, but you get what I'm saying. Like they're evil. Things are evil because God says they're evil. Things are good because God says they're good. But it's also the case that God has not allowed himself to actively will evil into existence, in a sense, or I shouldn't say into existence, but he hasn't. So to be good is to manifest or reflect God's qualities, like the divine names of God, right? So to be merciful, to be just, all that kind of good stuff. To be evil is to do the opposite, which is like to have a lack of those things. So to act with a lack of those divine qualities, even in the most minute sense, right? So to act without justice, without mercy, etc. There's also an interesting point in Arabic, which is that in Arabic, the word for evil that's used is also the word for like neediness, like extreme poverty or a lack of something. So there's like a kind of a innate connection. Just looking at the word of it, I guess we're doing that thing you were talking about of just, well, let's just define terms. But I do think that kind of helps like frame the way that you can look at this, where God is is like the font of life and like of good things, but he's also like the ultimate creator of everything. So in a sense, you could say that he is allowing evil, but he's not creating it, if that kind of makes sense. Does that
Yeah, I mean, I think
that
for me, the central idea, the central idea is that evil is not substantial. It's an ontology. So what you've got is an ontology of evil. It doesn't. Evil is a lack of something. I mean, this is how I understand the concept of evil that's central to Christian and Jewish and Islamic worldviews. I mean, I was interested to hear you say that, because that's the sort of the religious conception of evil that I got from Aquinas. So it's interesting that Islam has a similar view.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of borrowing and back and forth between like Christian thinkers and Muslim thinkers, and maybe not directly, like it wasn't necessarily the case that like Aquinas was sitting down with like Ibn Sina or something and hashing these things out, but the people were writing books and people are reading them and translating them, and these ideas kind of float around, and it's all rooted, like ultimately, just like the way that these things are thought through, it kind of goes back to like Greek philosophy and stuff. So
yeah, it goes back to Aristotle, because if you've got an idea of the end, that the telos of a particular kind, So what is the telos of a human being? What is the end of a human? What was a human being created to be? And you get from Aristotle this idea of eudaimonia, or eudaimonia, of flourishing. And I think you could fit this very easily into a theistic worldview, because you can talk about, well, what kind of creatures did God create us to be? And religion gives us a vision of the kind of creatures we could be. That is to say, the kind of creatures God created us to be. And sort of anything that inhibits us becoming those creatures, or is a lack of that good, that flourishing. Anything that is a lack of that good or that flourishing is an evil.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of like you can see that very clearly in the religions that came later.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this to me, because I only started encountering these ideas quite recently, and I would say that the general view of evil, I mean, if you were to ask someone, if you were to ask random people about it, you would generally, what if you were to ask them what is evil, the kind of responses you'd get would typically be either evil is very, very, very bad suffering, or evil is an action which inflicts suffering that is very, very, very bad. So evil is just an intensifier of bad.
Mm-hmm.
Or you'd get something like, well, evil is a religious idea which says there are demons in the world. Right? Evil is an inherent force. But what this view of evil suggests is that you can't have an inherently evil being.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a doctrine of evil, which is and so I think scholars of Aquinas would call this the doctrine of evil, as privatio boni, as privation of the good, right? Where good is a religious concept. It's the a kind of like a religious understanding of that Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, which I think Aquinas, at least, I think, did important to Christian thinking about this. But it seems to me to be perfectly reconcilable with a naturalistic worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you don't need to necessarily have some sort of like spiritual quest aspect of it or something to think that evil is just some sort of deficiency or something, instead of some sort of force or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is I don't know. This seems like a deep fact about the religious view of evil to me.
Sure.
But and I guess if you're wanting to be pedantic about it, you would have to say something like evil is a lack of the good that ought to be realized. Because
sure, yeah.
And then you think, well, what are the ways that evil can oppose good? It can be an obstacle to good. It could be just a mere lack. Or it could actively go against the good. It can actively oppose the good. And it's this active opposition to the good, which is generally, and I think common understandings of it, it's this active opposition to the good, which is typically, which would get most traction in a person's ordinary in a person's ordinary use of evil. It's this active opposition to the good, which they likely favor. But it's the idea that just a mere lack of it can be called evil on this view, if it ought to be realized, is gives you a picture of evil which is not inconsistent with the secular worldview, but is sort of outside people's ordinary usage of the term.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But I think it's better than ordinary usage, because if you're just using evil to say something's very, 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 very bad, then it's sort of like a concept that loses its meaning. It's taken out of the religious concept, which gave it its force. It's like a popsicle that's had all the flavor sucked out of it. It's like, oh, evil is just very, very, very bad. It's not. It's a word you don't need.
I think
that's true.
I think that with this whole side of things, though, like the what's salient about it for Christians is the like the whole debate around justification or something like that. Like, so it's not like the evil at different moments in life. I mean, that's like, you know, it might be something that you're like, why does this exist? This is like kind of woe is me kind of thing. But there's also that whole, like, it has to look at the whole historical arc of a person's life and like of the universe and all this stuff of like, you know, what is my role in that? And then you get into all the stuff about free will pretty quickly too, where it's like, well, okay, well, if God created that person, then they created the conditions for them to do that act or whatever. And also that, you know, if God has a plan, which he necessarily must have if he's omnipotent and omnipotent, then it's like, you know, is why, you know, what's the difference between creating conditions of autonomy when you're creating every single particular aspect of how they make that choice and the decision to make that choice and that choice really in that person. So I don't know, it does get, I think it is one of those things where you get pretty quickly to a sort of unsatisfactory kind of end of, you know, how does this apply then to the idea of judgment and stuff like that? Because it's like, it sort of makes sense at some level, like, you know, like just in very basic human terms, it's like, okay, well, you can just kind of, you know, if you're going to be judged for something, you have to be good. So that's fine. But when it gets into like religious terms and stuff, it's like, yeah, then it ends up coming back to again and again, you know, what does God want from us? Like, that's the question at that point. And if I think that in both Islam and Christianity, and Judaism, you know, at least, like the very, very basic end of the day answer for that is either something around like, well, you know, something about maybe love in general or something like that kind of thing, and respect of God or something like that. Or it kind of ends up really, I mean, a lot of the time just being like, well, we don't know kind of thing, you know, like it's a mystery. We don't, because we would never presume to know what God wants of us kind of thing. Is that idea? You know what I mean? Like in terms of like his overarching plan, because I mean, that's obviously a big debate in itself. It's like, you know, why would God need to create something? You know, number one, creating something that's deficient from our perspective or something like that, right? Why wouldn't they just, you know, like if it's an educative process, why do you need education if you could just instantly educate something, you know?
One of the responses to this, which I actually don't like all that, I mean, I don't like all that much, is that God has to obey logical rules, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, it's if you're a clever philosopher, you can make this work. But I think the right answer is the answer Tom just gave, which is a kind of a laugh, you know, the laugh which says that isn't enough.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think what this shows is that you have to give up on the idea of God as a person. I mean, I don't think you have to stop thinking about God as a person, I think. God isn't someone who acts in the way we act, who doesn't deliberate in the way we deliberate. And I mean, I know this suggestion is not, it's not orthodox. It's not orthodoxy, but you know, I'm not really formally part of any religion. You know, I'm
sure.
You know, if I had to put this on my Facebook bio, if I had to like say what I was on my Facebook bio, it would be still figuring things out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which is
free agent.
Yeah, which is a, you know, something I always roll my eyes at. That I've you know, as I've matured, I've had to realize that it applies to me. I don't think you can keep the idea of God as a personal agent. I
mean, I disagree. I think you need to. I agree on some level and disagree on another level. So I would say that you need to abandon the idea of God as like acting as just like a human put in charge of things. Like he's not just like you know, just a human being with a really interesting perspective on things and like access to some kind of ability to create stuff. You know, that's not like when we talk about God having like a personality or a personhood or something. I don't think that's a good way to think about it necessarily. But in terms of like having a personhood, I think that's kind of important, actually. Like I think understanding him to have, I mean, going back to the like the names and stuff, he has certain qualities and things. It's not just like some kind of it's not like a force of gravity where it's just like a natural force or something like that. Like on some level, I can understand looking at God that way, but I don't think that truly grasps the thing. And of course, the thing with God is you're never really going to truly grasp like the the identity and the like. You're never really going to completely understand God or anything. But I think it is important to understand that like he created things in a way that kind of reflects himself, and so it's not just some sort of like fundamental constant that undergirds the whole universe or something, but he is active in it, and he is sort of he has crafted things according to his own his own qualities.
I think you do have to keep the idea that he is active in the world.
Yeah. I mean, even prior to any like serious investigation of religion, the whole concept of like deism seemed like, why don't you just kind of give this up? Like, it doesn't seem like your heart's really in it. Like that's if you're gonna believe in God, like just believe in God. Why are you kind of doing this half in, half out stuff? No offense to any deists out there, but to me it seems a little bit bizarre.
No offense to like the 20 actual deists who exist. Yeah, it's no. I mean, deism was a kind of it was like an enlightenment, an enlightenment attempt to get a different view of God. No, I'm to be honest, I'm open to something like a pantheistic view of God. But I mean, I will point out though that first of all, God is very, very hard to talk about. Seems like an obvious point, but maybe we should keep that in mind. But the other thing is when you refer to God as he, you are speaking about God metaphorically.
Well, I'm simply using the terms that he uses for himself.
But we can only talk about him metaphorically. I mean, the idea, if you were to say, well, does God have the attributes of a male? It seems like an odd thing to suggest. I think there's a general assumption that when we use terms like this, we're speaking metaphorically. And I think most of the way we talk about God, in fact, we have to accept that most of the way we've talked about God is metaphorical. So when God does this, when we talk about God judging, when we talk about God acting in a particular way, we're applying concepts drawn from human life to understand.
Yeah, there's a thing that Muslims say about this, which is that for like each of these qualities of God or these names of God, like we say that, or if God describes himself as like doing something, seeing things, for example, we'll say that he sees, he like explicitly said that he sees, right? So we can't deny that, but he doesn't see the way we see. Or if it says he's all hearing, he hears, but he doesn't hear as we hear, so it's not the same kind of like, sound vibrations hitting our ear and like that creates sound and we interpret that and, we understand that to be sound. That's not what's happening for God. God is hearing, he's using these words so that we can understand it. When we hear things, that creates a certain experience for us, right? Like we have a certain experience of hearing things or seeing things or whatever, or, feeling certain emotions or whatever. And God has some kind of experience similar to that, but it's not at all the same. It's just he's using these terms so that we can kind of understand something on some level, depending on whatever he's trying to convey.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, there's, I think this question is addressed most directly in Christianity. And I'm sorry to any, theologians or learned, lay people who are about to hear me butcher my way through an interpretation of something Jesus said.
I mean, a general apology to theologians and learned people that listen to the podcast, I think. But
yeah, but when Jesus' disciples asked him why he spoke in parables, um, his I'm just trying to remember the wording. He says I speak in parables because they have eyes but they don't see, they have ears but they don't hear.
How about this one? Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive.
Yeah. So
I just Googled that. I guess it's Matthew 13:10.
Okay. So Jesus citing Isaiah here should be a warning for me not to try and interpret this passage, I think. But I can report my own what thinking about this passage has done for me, even if it's just an ironically awful misunderstanding of what he was trying to say. But there's a difference between seeing and seeing, if you know what I mean. We have to find a way to understand something as difficult as the kingdom of heaven. This is at least the Christian context. I mean, I think and to bring this back to the conversation about evil, right? If evil is privation of the good, you have to have a very, very clear conception of the good. And I think one thing that a religious conception of the good, at least in the Abrahamic religions, a religious conception of the good is going to be revealed. So we have it's always going to go beyond a conventional understanding of what is good for human beings. You're not going to be able to, what religion says, and I think, it's one of the reasons why I think I'm a religious person, is that you're not going to you're not going to understand what is good, what the proper end for a human being is. You're not going to fully what human flourishing is has to be revealed to us. We're not going to get it by just looking at the world and inferring it from our, empirical experience. So, I mean, the good is both real. You have to have a realist conception of the good, right? So, I mean, some philosophers suggest that moral language, that's good and that's bad, is nothing more than the expression of an emotion, right? So if you say that's good, you're saying yay, and if you're saying that's bad, you're saying boo. But there's no more semantic content than that. I mean, you can't have that view if you're religious.
But in the Quran it says some things are good for you even though you don't like it, something along these lines. Some things are good for you even though you do not like it, and some things are bad for you even though you may want it, something along those lines. So yeah, you can't just rely on your lower self, Yeah,
you have to accept that the good has been revealed.
Right.
But that doesn't require a personal God, I don't think. A God that has what we would...
Yeah, not necessarily.
So we refer to God as he, or we refer to God as a person, and we refer to God as performing actions because we need that language. That's the best understanding we're going to have. But I think it can sometimes mislead us. And when we say, why isn't God intervening here to stop this? We've turned him too much into a human.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's also it's making certain assumptions about the world. It really depends on the person who's kind of raising the complaint. But if you're saying that that there's a problem here because if God was good, he wouldn't allow this to happen or something like that. Or if God is good, why couldn't he just step in and stop this? If he doesn't, it either means that he's not good or it means that he can't, in which case he's not really God as we understand it, I think it sort of assumes that this world is supposed to be a certain way. And when it's not that way, that says something about God rather than our understanding of the world, Yeah.
Yeah. It's
and so you kind of have to accept the terms that are given to you, right? In in the Abrahamic religions, it's kind of laid out for you in a, the whole deal is kind of put forth, and it's not like you can't really just like pick and choose certain parts. It's kind of it's a packaged thing. So the idea isn't that God is great and you should worship him, and and there's heaven and hell, and then there's this world. You can't really like pick those apart, right? Like you have to kind of accept, like, yeah, this world isn't heaven and it's not hell either. So the fact that it's not heaven is not really that's not like a valid complaint against God. I don't know. I have like such a this whole thing has always been kind of a non-issue for me personally. Like I've never had a hard time grasping the idea, I think, about like you have to come to terms with the trials of this world and all this kind of thing, and so the problem of evil hasn't really been something I've personally had to like work through or something like that. But I also think it's not like I'm so smart that I figured it out. I think it's that I'm too dumb to figure out what the actual issue is. Yeah. So I'm just like, I don't know, seems to be okay to me, and I don't get what the big fuss is. But
yeah, there's I mean, I don't think the problem of evil has ever really made religious people seriously doubt that their religious commitment is right. I mean, I'm sure it's I mean, I'm sure it's I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen or that it's uncommon. It's just that I would say that it's not. I would say your view is fairly representative, Tom. It's in discussions in a philosophical context where you have atheists who think that, well, this is a drop dead argument against the existence of God, and if you're a reasonable person, you'll adjust your belief to the strength of the argument. This sort of misunderstands how people think and behave, and but it's also the case that I think one of the things that religion needs to do is say very clearly what good and evil is. And in fact, this is one of the reasons that religion exists, because there is an existential problem of evil. So I mean, the philosophical problem is the logical problem, or the intellectual problem of evil. But evil is, before it's an intellectual problem, it's an existential problem.
Yeah.
And
so like,
you can't confuse the two, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that I think is maybe kind of potentially useful in this conversation, like kind of following on this idea, is that the question of like, well, why kind of even create these conditions where it's unclear? Why create the conditions where good and evil, like where evil is even a possibility? Why not just kind of have people be perfect from the get-go, and it's just good, and that's it, like kind of like just create people, put them in heaven, right? So the very basic, like, which doesn't, I don't know if it really answers the question, but I think it does sort of I think it informs things a little bit. It is the idea that, well, that's what angels are. We're not angels, we're something else, right? So angels are like perfect servants of God. They don't have their own free will, so they kind of just follow God's commands perfectly, the way that the natural world does, right? The way that like gravity does, the way that the laws of physics do, the way that animals do. At least like in Islamic theology, they're all considered Muslim in the sense that they are submitted to God's will perfectly. Like there's not even a possibility of moving outside of that. Human beings are not like that. Human beings can direct themselves to some extent. It gets kind of complicated when you consider things like, well, God created them, God created all their conditions and all that kind of stuff that determines a lot of the ways they behave and stuff, but that's a separate discussion. But for this, I think part of it is that we're supposed to come to understand what we are as well, So if the question is like, well, why aren't things the way that I would want them to be, or why aren't things the way that I think they should be, in terms of like, well, God should just kind of stop all this and all that. I think that's almost part of the point, right? Like that's almost why we were created is sort of this, God, Don referred to it as like an educative process. I think that's a key thing to understand, and we may not fully comprehend why it's being done the way that it's being done. Like, why can't he just like matrix, like just throw this knowledge in our head and we just download everything and get it from the get-go? Maybe there's a reason for that, right? In fact, there has to be a reason for that from like my, from a religious perspective. I think you have to believe that. But it's not necessarily something we can just suss out, I think maybe you have to get to the end before that really becomes clear. I don't know.
I think that like the thing here though with this is that if it's an educative process, I think that kind of makes sense, and then you can kind of get into some maybe liberal theory of education or something where you're like, well, you need the freedom to, make mistakes and kind of bring it into your actual being, so it becomes like a habitus kind of thing. Like it's like you actually need to, you have to have the freedom to dip into evil or make, not perform, to be able to actually, build yourself into a moral being capable of, making good choices and all that kind of stuff, and attuning yourself to God in different ways. Like that kind of makes sense. But then it's kind of like that sort of educative process still has like a developmental sort of model to it, where it's like you're developing, for something that is like some sort of plan, like or some sort of outcome that God requires. It's almost like as if God has like a HR department and he needs certain souls to be in certain condition or something, and this is the way to do it or something. Like it's like why does he need souls or something like that kind of thing, or that kind of, that's the issue with it. But so it's kind of like it makes sense in that level. It's like, okay, well, we have to, and I mean it even makes sense really in a kind of silly, trivial level where you're like, well, yeah, you're just like abstracting from nature, where we obviously try to develop ourselves in different ways and stuff. But anyways, I think that that's the problem there though, is that like you can't, if it's educative, then it's like it's first for some functioning, and then you're like, well, what is the functioning of humans after they're educated? So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think a trap you want to avoid is thinking that God needs us for something, right? God doesn't need anything, He creates because that's just part of his. It's one of his names. He's the creator. He created us because he loves us. Like, so, in the end, this is all for our benefit somehow.
But then sorry, but to interrupt. But then it's then that kind of negates the rest of the arguments, because it's like if there's no reason, if you're saying there's no actual, so if God is sufficient in some way that he doesn't need to create anything, I mean, it's just pure generosity, then there's no educative functioning. There's no reason why someone has to be it's just like a pure gift. It's like, okay, well then there doesn't really need, like, why would there be a judgment then? Like, or why would there be, like unless you get into this thing where you just have to say those are just really, really abstract metaphors that we can't understand. And then eventually I think you have to kind of take a step back and say, I don't know, but the fact that it's educative makes sense because it's being explained in this way, but it doesn't necessarily actually apply to, we just don't know at the end of the day. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that's the attitude that you should always have with
Sure.
any kind of discussion like this. There's a concept in Islam that I think kind of helps me to understand this, which is like the idea of God's banquet, and that it's this comes from like medieval period and stuff. So it's like a king has this great banquet, and he invites everybody to come just to enjoy, right? So you're called to the banquet, and it's up to you to decide to go to the banquet. And what the banquet is to enjoy all these like divine qualities that he has given us the ability to either cultivate or simply act upon. Certain things are going to be easier for other people, are going to come more naturally than than they are for others, right? Everybody's different when it comes to this sort of stuff. So it's really just up to us to decide, yeah, that sounds good. I want to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think that kind of maintains that generosity of creation and all that, but it also sort of allows for that, we can call it educative, or we can call it enjoyment, where this is a place where we can prepare for the next world, and in a sense of like discovering certain things.
See, now the
I don't know.
preparing for the next world is not something that I necessarily want to push back against. But
Mm-hmm.
when I think about, and again, to maybe tie this back to evil, what is the good of which evil is a privation? It is, I think, in at least theistic religion, the good that's been revealed has to be a good which is attainable in this world. So whatever your view of the supreme good is, and I think Christians and Muslims and Jewish people, at least in this tradition, wouldn't have too much trouble in reaching a broad agreement on this. Instances of the supreme good, not the whole good, maybe, but there are, for instance, perfect justice in human relationships. With which reflect, say, an agape, like a agape, the sort of the divine love, which Christian philosophers are so fond of talking about. This is achievable, right? So this educative process, you don't necessarily, I don't think you have to see it exclusively as this mysterious thing which is going to be attained after we die.
Mm-hmm.
I think this view, I think the ontology of good and evil, which we've been talking about, which I would personally want to defend, is it's not indifferent to the question of the next life, but it has a lot to say about this one and what we can do in it. And I don't know, on this point, I always think of, there's this passage in Luke where Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is among you." This seems to me to be quite an important statement for Christians, of course, at least. Mm-hmm. People won't say, "Oh, where is it?" Let me see if I can find the right verse. Right. Yep. When asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, "The kingdom of God will not come with observable signs, nor will people say, 'Look, here it is,' or 'there it is.' For you see, the kingdom of God is in your midst." And this, at least, I mean, this isn't saying forget about the afterlife, right? We need to create a heaven on earth, but it does seem to be suggesting that a theistic view of the good should be one which says it is one which you can realize in your day-to-day, in your daily life. Now, the problem of evil is that, and this is something that is, I think, an important part of a religious worldview, is that evil seems to be very deep and very entrenched. Because, I mean, the view of evil, which I think you need to have, is not one which says there are people which are inherently evil. What this view of evil says is that the lack of the good can run very deep. It doesn't seem to matter how good people want to be. We seem to be stuck in a situation where evil and suffering is an almost permanent feature of human existence. So even though it can be realized in some narrow cases, when you look at the broad sweep of history, when you look at the world as it is, it seems to be something that's very, very difficult to escape. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that religion therefore needs to be understood as doing is helping us cope with that fact. And you're not going to be able to cope with that fact if you have a view of good and evil where it's something that you could just easily fix. Mm-hmm. where people can just decide to be better. And I don't think it's going to help you cope with it if you think, well, we can't do anything about it in this world. We have to wait till we die. or we have to wait till we're resurrected. Or whatever. That can't be the religious view of evil, or it shouldn't be, because it puts you at odds with the world. It doesn't help you deal with it. You're not going to realize the kingdom of heaven, in your own life if that's your view. So, I mean, I think there are good religious reasons for not overemphasizing the next life when you're trying to deal with this. I mean, I don't know. I tie myself up in knots thinking about this.
Yeah, it's tricky. I hope I haven't been doing this, like overemphasizing
No.
the afterlife. That's not what I'm trying to do, but I do think it's like a salient factor, right? Like it's a emphasis that has a lot of importance in a religious worldview, and I think it does kind of need to. I hear what you're saying 100%, and I agree, but it is something that needs to be taken into consideration.
That's true. But I mean, what I do think is true is that we're not going to be who we are in the next life. However the next life is understood. I mean, you do have to have an understanding of the next, at least in Christianity. I mean, the talk about eternal life is something that you can't just sort of liberally hand wave away, right? You have to have a way of understanding it. But I mean, for me, the main question is, and it's I may be dangerously close to Greek philosophy if you're a conservative Christian, but it's what is the good for a particular kind? What is it that constitutes human flourishing? What does it mean for a human being to be fulfilled?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a religious view of fulfillment is also going to have an overarching view of fulfillment, in which the good for human beings is just part of an overall good. But I don't really know how to say anything sensible about what an overall good might be. So I mean, I think this view preserves a kind of the educative process that you were talking about before, Don, but it makes it more it grounds it a little bit more.
Sure.
This is why I sort of like the making the Aristotelianism a little bit more overt, at least in my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's about ethical flourishing instead of some sort of supernatural flourishing or something, maybe in some way. So
yeah. And I think that what the view, and this gets back to the view of evil that you outlined right at the very beginning, Tom, is it's not supernatural. Right? That's not a view of evil which involves any supernatural commitments, and it's not a view of, it doesn't imply or entail a view of good which requires any supernatural commitments. But then again, I think you can get a bit too hung up also. When I say you, I mean in general. And by the way, I didn't before think you were overemphasizing the next life stuff or anything, but I saw it as an excuse to say something, and I selfishly just like
no worries.
Barreled ahead with it and implicated you in something I didn't mean to. But I mean, like the metaphysics. The metaphysics is, like, if you sit down and actually think about what, like, the metaphysics of the next life is, you find that you can't really, I mean, you can't think straight. It's something you can't think straight about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you put it this way. I mean, why does belief in an afterlife for so many, why does it seem to entail there to be, why does it seem to require like a non-physical realm? Or why does it require, like, non-physical properties? And then you have the straightforwardly scientific question, which is, what is matter, right? And you look at any of these issues for more than 10 seconds, and you realize that the ordinary categories of judgment we have are completely incapable of grasping these questions. And that's one reason why I think a lot of the sort of the supernatural metaphysical stuff can be a bit, can sort of like draw us away from what religion really is doing, which is telling us what the good is, what the end for religion tells me at least what the end of the telos of a human being is. What is it that makes us flourish? I think it's revealed that for me. So in that sense, I am I am religious. And I don't really feel the need to make any supernatural commitments, or even think about it enough to say what a supernatural commitment even would be.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, just on the issue of like how tied up in knots thinking about this stuff can get you, I think there's a danger in that, and that it can kind of keep you away from like the actual point of it all. Like you kind of get so lost in these kind of questions that the ethical commitments that you should have like in your day-to-day kind of get lost. There's this story of a very famous Islamic theologian who's walking in the streets, and he's known for having so many different proofs for the existence of God and all this kind of stuff. And an old woman stops him and says, "Oh, so you're the one with all these proofs for the existence of God, huh?" And he goes, "Oh, yes, that's me. I've written many things like that." And she's like, "Oh, with so many proofs, you must have, so many doubts that you need to conquer."
Yeah.
And she just kind of walks on. And then the theologian is like, he makes a prayer and asks that we all have the faith of old women.
Yeah,
that's the danger of philosophy.
sure. Yeah,
philosophy is very dangerous.
I've just been thinking about like how people will often kind of mock religious people for having like these very simple-minded kind of ideas about heaven or about God and things like that. But I think there's like some functionality in that at a certain point, it's all just sort of like guesswork. Like you can't really say. I mean, maybe it's interesting to people who kind of have an inclination towards like pondering those kinds of questions. But at a certain point, that's not what really matters. That's not what God doesn't want you to kind of answer these riddles or something, right? God wants you to act a certain way. Like we know very clearly it gets maybe not super clearly. It gets complicated, but we have a general sense of what God wants, right? Like how to be good, how to avoid being evil, all this kind of stuff. As you've been saying, that's like one of the main functions of religion, right? Is to kind of keep people, to teach people to do right and to avoid wrong and all that kind of stuff. So, I just think that for a lot of people, having a really simple understanding of these more esoteric kind of metaphysical concepts, it kind of helps to ground them in the reality of like, okay, well, when you go to hell, you're burning and it sucks. When you go to heaven, there's like nice fruits and like everything's nice all the time and all this kind of stuff. So that sounds pretty good. So I'll just remind myself of that to keep on track. I think there's like a very practical kind of purpose to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Like it's almost as if like writing L on your left hand and R on your right hand, or whatever. Like instead of... You're like, well, I got the basics down. I got my directions. That's what I need. So
sure. I mean, people. There's so many different people, and God wants to save all of them, right? Like God created all of them out of love, right? So like it's supposed to be for everybody, so it needs to kind of be able to be boiled down to something very simple. And I like to think that the most kind of like simple-minded take on religion, or the most simple-minded kind of understanding of religion, and the most like convoluted, philosophically minded take somehow can cohere, like that they can both be true at the same time, and that's maybe the people at either ends of the spectrum won't be able to see it that way, but God can look at it and be like, yeah, you guys got the right idea.
Let's put it this way. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus didn't stand up and say, God is God is greater than that which can be imagined. You can't imagine anything greater than God, so by a law of logic, God has to be real because, existence is a property of greatness or whatever. Something can't be great and not exist. So, and God is greater than anything else that can be imagined, so therefore God exists. That's not the kind of thing he was saying. Right?
Yeah.
He said, the first thing he said is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then he said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And that, that's not arcane theology. It's not philosophy. It's not scholasticism. And then you get it, but it had one of the things that I love about that passage is it talks about what a huge impact it had on the people who were listening. They were that's something I always like to dwell on when I read that. People were astonished when they heard him speak. I mean, part of that is to do with the assumptions that they had about the law that Jesus claimed to be coming in fulfillment of. But I think it still has the power to move people, and it's not because it's clever. When you hear the phrase "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth," you can dismiss it as saying it's like, oh well, that's just religious. It's just we're supposed to believe that there's some afterlife where the meek will inherit the earth. But if you try to think about it seriously, it's a very it makes you want to shut up. do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's a theme. These ideas run through our culture, our civilization, very, very deeply. I mean, when Marx was saying that the proletariat was going to be forged through suffering, and then would deliver a utopia of equality. I know he didn't use these words because he decided that for whatever reason that he thought it would be better if he presented everything as a science. But I mean, he was saying that he was essentially saying the meek will inherit the earth. The proletariat are going to be the agents who unify philosophy with reality.
Mm-hmm.
The most despised, and the proletariat had the characteristics they did because they suffered so much. I mean, I think you can have all the the technical definitions of what a working class person is, and bitch and moan about them on Twitter all day. But the proletariat in the Marxist worldview were what they were because they suffered. And in that suffering, they were going to be the agents of equality. They were going to end class division. That is I'm not saying that's what makes Marxism a religion. I mean, I kind of think it is, but for different reasons. But that's the influence of Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It made that kind of thinking possible.
For sure.
And Nietzsche tried to put it back in the box, and it sent him around the bend. It made him crazy in the end. So don't try and put it back in the box.
Sure.
That's how you get syphilis, folks.
Yeah. Sorry, so I know talking about a minor Muslim prophet like this is you have to be careful about it, but prophet, not prophet, but what would the proper term be?
Perhaps Wali,
Yeah.
if you're going to go that far. A friend of God.
Friend of God, okay, that's good. Well, we're all friends of God, aren't we? On this show, at least.
That has some technical sense, meaning to it, but yeah,
not to me, which is why I can say it without going to hell.
Yeah.
Did we want to maybe have concluding thoughts on this kind of stuff? I'm starting to run out of steam mentally. I think that my big thinking cap, I don't know, reached its limit for the day or whatever. But, I really appreciate the conversation, but I just thought kind of wrap things up a bit.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, so I feel like my idea, evil is privation. That's the ontology of evil that you have in a theistic religion. And the consequences of this are worth thinking about, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. That's like the understanding that I have come to as well. And yeah, I don't know what else I really have to add.
Sure.
I feel like I said earlier, a lot of this stuff sort of goes over my head a little bit, and I don't know that I fully grasp like the gravity of some of these questions that people raise. I think a lot of times it's also just the case that the people raising them aren't doing the best job of like, it's like, well, why did God create bone cancer in kids, or all this kind of stuff, and that's not like a compelling argument to me. So I don't know. We didn't really get into specifics about that kind of stuff, but I assume most people listening to this are kind of like they, probably have their own answers to those kinds of things. And I don't know.
Yeah, for me, I mean, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry. You go. I've talked enough.
I guess, yeah, for me, I mean, I tend to be very critical of my own arguments a lot of the time. Like in my head, I'm just like always thinking of like the weakest point and like trying to attack it in different ways and stuff. Pretty much everything that I do, but also political arguments and stuff in theology. And it's funny because with this kind of thing, with problem and evil and stuff, it's like at such a high level that I start like ping ponging, you know, like in my head. I'm like, I go, that's a weak point, that's a weak point, that's a weak point, that's a weak point. Like between all the different like things where I'm like, okay, so it's educative, but then do you have autonomy? Do you have free will? No. Okay. And I'm like bouncing around. And so while we've been talking, that's happened too. I'm like, wait a minute, there's that there, and then there's this, and I don't know. I think that makes it worthwhile thinking through though, because it's like it at least gives you like a ability to like sort of kick the tires of what's going on, kind of thing. You know, like know the basic framework of how you are approaching religion and things like that. So
yeah. It's
yeah, for sure.
It's funny. Like there's a problem. I mean, one of the starkest philosophical statements of one of the problems, and one of the rare instances where I think philosophy can actually be clarifying, is the Euthyphro dilemma, which Plato puts in Socrates' mouth, where they're trying to work out what piety is, and the question is, do the gods love? If take any pious act, do the gods love it because it's pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? And you don't have to assume paganism in order for that question to be, pertinent. It's I think something that theists should spend some time thinking about. And I think the obvious answer is God loves it because it is pious. And for me, that's a fairly clear answer. Why it's correct can send me on the same ping-ponging back and forth that you very vividly described, Don. But I've not really left in any doubt that that's the right answer. And
I feel exactly the same way about the other side. That's kind of funny to me.
See, now that's where you can have actually interesting discussions. But I'll finish, and I promise I won't, because I've been babbling a little bit at times, because this is a difficult subject matter. But I was listening to some testimony from Holocaust survivors, and there was one of the men who was talking, who had been forced to work as a capo, was recalling a rabbi who knew that he was being, knew that he was what was going on. He'd worked it out. He wasn't in denial. And this person said he recalled the rabbi crying out, saying, "God, what they're doing is a crime against you. This is a crime against you. Show them your power." And then he said, and nothing happened. And the rabbi said, "I don't believe in God anymore." Now, this could be something that he misremembered. I mean, I don't think it really matters, right? If he's reported it exactly. This was significant for him. And I think talk about piety. I think it's impious for me to have a strong view on this, to try and analyze what this person was going through, because it is so extraordinarily horrendous. It really does, go beyond any understanding. But the idea that there was a sort of a crime, someone was breaking one of God's laws, someone was doing something that God had said you cannot do, and that God should therefore show his power and stop it. This, I think, is an understanding of God which we shouldn't have it. And one of the reasons we shouldn't have it is because this view of God deprived the rabbi of, I think, one of his most precious, and as he would have probably understood it, one of the most precious things in his life, which was faith and trust in God. And he was deprived of it in the most evil way possible. And I don't want there to be any odd ideas. It was the Nazis who deprived him of that. I'm not saying he made some intellectual mistake, but listening to that made me think very, very carefully about the kind of God I believe in. Because you can find yourself in a very dark place if you've got, you don't, this is something that maybe it's sometimes worth tying yourself up in knots about sometimes.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate the conversation. I don't know. This is it's good. We kind of, again, it's one of those things where you just kind of, I don't know, you wrench a bit around kind of thing, trying to figure out, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I don't know. Thanks.
All right. Well, and to anyone who's still listening, well done.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Freddy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right, guys. So if you enjoyed this episode of You Can't Win, you can get another one by subscribing to our Patreon, and you'll get that as well as access to our Discord. If you want to send us anonymous questions that we usually answer at the end of our episodes, you can do that by going to the Twitter account at YouCanWinPod, and you'll find a link to the Curious Cat posted there. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, guys. Bye.